It is the most recognizable building constructed anywhere in the 20th century. Not the tallest, not the largest, but if you drew its outline on a piece of paper in almost any country on Earth, somebody would tell you what it was. It sits on a spit of land in a harbour at the bottom of the world, and it has become the thing people picture when they think of an entire continent. When it was inscribed on the World Heritage List, the committee wrote that it stands by itself as one of the indisputable masterpieces of human creativity, not only in the 20th century, but in the history of humankind. The man who designed it never saw it. He did not die before it was finished. He was alive for another 35 years after it opened. He simply never came back. He left Australia in April of 1966, 7 years before the building was completed, and for the remaining 4 decades of his life, he never returned to look at it. You have probably heard that he was not invited to the opening. Almost every account says so. Newspapers have printed it, obituaries have printed it, and for years the encyclopedia entry said it too. It is not true. And the real version, which sat in a state archive until recently, is stranger and far more human than the myth. His name was Jørn Utzon. He was Danish, 38 years old when he won the commission, and almost completely unknown. Now, there is a second architect in this story, and almost nobody knows his name at all. He was Australian, young and brilliant, and years before any of this, he won a travelling scholarship that took him around Europe. While he was there, he made a point of going to a small town on the Danish coast to visit a designer he admired. That designer was Jørn Utzon. Keep that visit in mind, because that young man would end up finishing the building, and it would cost him nearly everything. The place is called Bennelong Point, a small finger of land sticking out into Sydney Harbour, immediately east of the Harbour Bridge. It is Gadigal country, and its name in the language of the people who lived there is Tubalgul. It was a gathering place for many thousands of years, where people came together, ate, sang, and told stories, which is a fact that becomes almost unbearably neat later on. After the British arrived, it became a fort, then a tram depot. By the 1940s, it was a shed full of trams sitting on the best piece of land in Sydney. And Sydney had no proper concert hall. The symphony was playing in the town hall. A city that thought of itself as the leading city of Australia had nowhere adequate to put an orchestra, and among the people who cared about such things, this was becoming embarrassing. The man who did something about it was the Premier of New South Wales, Joseph Cahill. In 1954, he gave approval for a musical facility on Bennelong Point, and in 1956, he launched an international competition to design it. Then he did the thing that actually made it possible, which was to work out how to pay for it without asking taxpayers directly. He set up a lottery. The Opera House lottery ran for years and funded the whole thing. Australians bought tickets, and the proceeds built the building. It is a detail that gets forgotten, and it matters enormously, because for a long stretch it gave the project unusual artistic freedom and extensive funding that did not come out of a budget line anybody had to defend in Parliament. Cahill died in 1959, and from his deathbed he entrusted the Opera House to his Minister for Public Works. He never saw it either. The competition attracted 233 entries from architects in around 30 countries. The judging panel included Eero Saarinen, the Finnish-American architect who would design the Gateway Arch in St. Louis. He was by some distance the most celebrated modernist in the room. And here the story becomes legend, and should be labelled as such, because it is repeated everywhere and cannot be fully verified. The account that has come down is that Utzon's entry had already been set aside in the rejected pile when Saarinen went through the discards, pulled out the drawings, and announced that this was the winner. Whether or not it happened exactly that way, what is certain is that on the 29th of January 1957, Premier Cahill announced that scheme number 218 had won. The drawings were extraordinary, and they were also, by the standards of an architectural competition, almost useless. They showed a series of enormous curved shells on a raised platform, rendered in a loose, expressive hand. There were no detailed elevations. There was very little indication of how any of it might actually stand up. Utzon had drawn something nobody knew how to build, and a panel of judges had given him the job of building it. He was 38. He had built houses in Denmark and won some competitions. He had never built anything remotely on this scale. Construction began on the 2nd of March, 1959, and it began before anybody had solved the central problem, which was that the roof could not be built. Utzon's competition drawings showed shells that were free-form curves, each one a different shape. Concrete does not work that way, or rather it does, but only if you will build a unique set of timber formwork for every piece, at a cost nobody could contemplate. The government wanted the thing started because a started building is politically much harder to cancel than a planned one. So work began on the podium, while Utzon and the engineers at Over Arup and Partners tried to work out what to do about the roof. They tried parabolas, they tried ellipsoids, scheme after scheme, for the better part of 4 years. There is one detail from the start of that process that tells you everything. In 1958, the engineers asked Utzon to define the curves of the roof mathematically. He took a plastic ruler, bent it against the edge of a table, and traced the curve it made. He sent those drawings to London and said these were the shapes he wanted. An architect describing a roof with a bent ruler and a firm of engineers being asked to make it stand up. 12 trial schemes were worked through, and then Utzon found it, and the solution is one of the most elegant things in modern architecture. He was alone in his office in Denmark one evening, stacking the model shells to clear some space, when he noticed how similar the shapes suddenly looked. Until that moment, each had seemed a distinct object. Stacked, they looked like variations of one thing. So he made every shell a piece cut from the surface of a single sphere, the same sphere. Every shell, every rib, every panel, taken from the skin of one imaginary ball with a radius of about 75 meters, which meant the curvature was constant everywhere and the pieces could be mass-produced, cast on the ground in reusable molds and lifted into place. Afterwards, he explained it using an orange, cutting the peel into curved triangular segments to show how one sphere could yield many different shapes. It is called the spherical solution, and it is the moment the building became possible. But it had taken years, and those were years in which the meter was running, and the delay would later be used against him by people with no interest in what the problem had actually been. Picture Bennelong Point on a morning in 1963 when the arches were going up. The podium is there, an enormous stepped platform on the point, and rising out of it are the concrete ribs, curving up into nothing, held on scaffolding while the next segment is craned into place. From across the water, it looks less like a building than like the fossil of something. That platform is not an accident. Utzon had traveled in Mexico and stood on the great stone platforms of the Mayan temple cities, where the builders raised a flat plane above the jungle so that a person standing on it looked out at the sky rather than at the trees. That is what the podium at Bennelong Point is doing. You climb the steps, the city drops away, and you are standing on a plateau in the middle of a harbour. Remember that. It comes back at the very end. Ferries come past. The harbour bridge stands behind it. Sydney has never seen anything remotely like this, and depending on who you ask, it is either the most exciting thing that has ever happened in the country or an enormous and increasingly expensive folly. Utzon has moved his entire office out from Denmark and is living in Sydney permanently with his family, on site constantly. He is 45. The shells are working. The riddle has been solved. Everything that follows comes from one thing, and it is not the architecture. It is that the number keeps going up. When construction began in 1959, the estimated cost of the building was £3.5 million. By the middle of 1962, the estimate had reached £13.7 million. That is roughly a four-fold increase in 3 years, and it is worth being fair about why. Some of it was the roof, which nobody had known how to build. Some of it was that the government had ordered the project started before the design was finished, which is the most reliable way ever devised to make a building cost more than it should. And some of it was the government changing its own mind. But the public did not see a list of causes. The public saw a number that kept moving, and a Danish architect insisting on complete control. Norman Ryan, the Minister for Public Works who had inherited the project from Cahill's deathbed, stepped up his supervision. By 1964, the partner running Arup's Sydney office, Michael Lewis, was raising concerns about whether Utzon could produce the sheer volume of drawings the interiors would require. Ryan demanded the drawings. Utzon said he could not produce them until he had built prototypes of the plywood beams he intended to use to hold up the ceilings and support the glass walls. That deadlock, plywood against paper, is what the whole thing eventually turned on. Here is the pivot of the story, and it is an election. In May of 1965, after 24 years of Labor government in New South Wales, Robert Askin's Liberals formed a coalition with the Country Party and took power. They had campaigned, in part, on reining in the cost of the Opera House. Utzon was initially hopeful because his relations with the outgoing Labor minister had become strained, and he thought a change might help him. It was the beginning of the end. The new Minister for Public Works was Davis Hughes, and it is worth knowing who Davis Hughes was, because the record on him is remarkable. He was a Tasmanian, a former schoolteacher, and he became leader of the Country Party in New South Wales in 1958. His term lasted about a year. He was forced to resign in 1959 after it was revealed that he did not hold the university degree he had claimed. He had attended university. He had not graduated. So, the man about to destroy Jørn Utzon over questions of professional competence had himself been driven out of a party leadership for misrepresenting his own qualifications. And, in that same year, when Cahill sealed the plaque marking the start of construction, Hughes secured himself a prominent place in the commemorative book, writing that the Opera House marked the beginning of a new phase in Australian history. 6 years later, he campaigned against its cost. Hughes made himself the project's master by taking the public works portfolio rather than the deputy leadership he could have had. 3 months into office, he declared that Utzon would from then on be paid only for producing drawings. Read that carefully, because it is the whole trap. Utzon could not produce the Stage 3 drawings until he had tested the plywood. To test the plywood, he needed £60,000 for prototypes. Hughes asked Arup's engineers, who were more accustomed to steel, whether the plywood scheme would work, and they expressed doubts. So Hughes had a report questioning the prototypes. Without prototypes, there were no drawings. And without drawings, under the rule Hughes had just written, there was no payment. At noon on the 28th of February 1966, Utzon went to Hughes's office in Bridge Street. He had come to discuss a fee of £51,626 owed to him for managing the stage machinery contracts, outstanding for 4 months. He also pressed for the plywood money. That unpaid fee matters more than it sounds. Without it, he could not pay his own staff. He was not asking for a favour. He was asking to be paid for work already completed so he could pay the wages of the people who had done it. Hughes said he could not make a decision and cited the adverse report from the engineers. Utzon threatened to quit, and Hughes said, "You are always threatening to quit." Utzon walked out. The meeting had lasted barely 15 minutes. Hours later, his secretary hand-delivered a letter in which Utzon accused the minister of forcing him out. The wording that has come down from it is direct and slightly broken, the English of a man writing in his second language while very angry. "You have forced me to leave the job." Hughes moved immediately. He arranged for an opera house without Utzon. He obtained assurances from the engineers and the builders that they would stay on the job. And, having secured that, he told the press that evening, and Parliament the following day, that Jørn Utzon had resigned. 9 years of work ended in a quarter of an hour. What happened next has no real parallel in Australian public life. Letters of protest arrived from artists and intellectuals around the world. On the 3rd of March, 1,000 people marched on State Parliament, led by the architect Harry Seidler and the novelist Patrick White, who would later win the Nobel Prize for Literature. A group calling itself Utzon in Charge held a further rally and delivered 3,000 signatures to the Premier. And architects working inside the government's own public works department screen-printed posters that read simply, "Bring Utzon back." Civil servants were printing protest posters against their own minister. It did not work. Hughes offered Utzon a reduced role as a subordinate consultant, which he would not take. On the 10th of March, Jack Zunz, the senior Arup partner in London who had overseen the shells, sent a confidential telegram begging him to reconsider. He wrote that the possibility of an opera house without Utzon was bleak to contemplate, that over many years Utzon had spared neither himself nor the people he had inspired, and that he could not ditch them now. Utzon was unmoved. A week later, Michael Lewis, the Arup partner in Sydney whose own relations with Utzon had soured, wrote the saddest document in the file. He said the break now seemed beyond repair. Then he added that he had the feeling Utzon had wanted to accept their terms but was too proud to say so directly, and that in spite of his own previous misgivings, he felt terribly sad for Utzon's sake. Too proud to say it directly. On the 19th of April, Hughes appointed a new panel of Australian architects to finish the building. 9 days after that, on the 28th of April, 1966, Jørn Utzon and his family flew out of Australia. They boarded the plane minutes before the doors closed, timed so the press could not reach them. On the way back to Europe, they stopped in the Yucatan, and Utzon went to look at the Mayan temples. The same platforms, the same idea he had carried to Sydney 9 years earlier and built into the podium now standing finished in the harbour behind him, with somebody else's name about to go on the rest of it. He went to see the thing that started it, on his way home from the thing that ended it. In his luggage was an incomplete set of the Stage 3 drawings, and he told his staff before he left that Hughes would eventually realise the opera house could not be completed without him, and that he expected to be back within 2 years. He was never invited back. Now we come back to that young man on the travelling scholarship. His name was Peter Hall, a scholarship student at Cranbrook School, a combined architecture and arts degree at the University of Sydney, and a travel scholarship that gave him a year in Europe, during which he went to Hellebuck to visit Jørn Utzon. He came home to work for the New South Wales government architect, and he was very good. A dining hall he helped design at the University of New South Wales won the Solman Medal, one of the country's most prestigious architectural awards. In early 1966, he resigned to start his own practice. And then the government architect came to him with the opera house. Hall said no. He said no because he had publicly lobbied for Utzon's return. He was on the other side of this argument. They asked again. This time he said he would accept, but only if there was genuinely no possibility of Utzon coming back. Then he telephoned Jørn Utzon and spoke to him directly. And after that conversation, Peter Hall took the job. He told a newspaper, "I am overwhelmed, but I think I can finish the opera house." His own profession never forgave him. Many of his fellow architects held that nobody but Utzon should ever complete that building, and taking the commission made him, in their eyes, the man who profited from a scandal. He was 34 years old. Hall took the job believing he would be executing Utzon's plans. He assumed the design existed, and his job was to carry it out. It did not exist. What Utzon had left behind were sketches. There were no working drawings, and the drawings showing his most recent thinking were not there at all. Roughly 5,000 sketches and drawings had been placed into storage by Utzon's office assistant, Bill Wheatland, where they would sit, largely unseen, until 1972. So the man who had accepted the job of finishing another man's building discovered that the building had not been designed. What Hall did next tells you what sort of architect he was. He went overseas for months, visiting Utzon's own consultants, the engineers and the acousticians and the specialists, and concert halls in Japan, Europe and the United States. He was trying to reconstruct a mind. A year after Utzon left, a back channel opened, and there were quiet explorations of whether he might return to collaborate. Utzon insisted Hall keep those conversations away from Arup and from his own associates. Nothing came of it. On the 17th of January, 1967, the 2,194th precast shell segment was lifted into place and the roof was finished. Stage 3 was the interiors, and it was enormous. The glass walls alone were a problem nobody had solved. Utzon had envisaged curtains of glass that appeared to hang from the shells. What Hall and Arup produced preserved that visual intent while making it stand up, using more than 6,000 square meters of glass ordered from France. It was recognised internationally as an extraordinary achievement in its own right, and it delivered the thing Utzon wanted most from the foyers, which was that the people inside should feel the harbour all around them. The bigger change was the main hall. Pressure had been building from the government and from the national broadcaster to make it work properly for the Sydney Symphony Orchestra. Utzon's design had been dual purpose, opera and concerts in one room. Hall studied the question in Europe and America and came back convinced the dual purpose approach was inferior. He recommended a single purpose hall for symphonic music. The government agreed at once. The main hall became the concert hall, and the smaller hall, intended for stage productions, became the opera theatre, which is why to this day the opera in the Sydney Opera House takes place in the smaller room. That decision is the one Hall has been attacked for ever since. It is also the one the government wanted, the broadcaster wanted, and the orchestra wanted. The Sydney Opera House opened to the public in September of 1973, and Queen Elizabeth II formally opened it on the 20th of October. 300,000 people lined the harbour foreshore. It was broadcast around the world. The final cost was $102 million, against an original estimate of about $7 million. 14 years instead of 4. The lottery had paid for nearly all of it. Now, there is a story about that day that almost everybody repeats, and it is not true. The story is that Utzon was not invited, and that his name was never spoken. You will find it in newspapers, in documentaries, and on school worksheets. It has been repeated for decades. He was invited. The Premier invited him, and he declined. The letter survives. It was pulled from the State Archives by a curator at Museums of History New South Wales, researching the building's 50th anniversary, and it settled the question. Utzon wrote back to Askin politely and explained that he could not come. His reasoning is the whole tragedy in one sentence. He said he could not be a guest of the government of New South Wales and at the same time criticise one of its ministers. Think about what that means. If he flew to Sydney, the press would be waiting. They would ask what he thought of interiors somebody else had designed. They would ask about Davis Hughes, who would be at the ceremony. And he would either have to lie or stand on Australian soil as the government's guest and attack the government's minister. So he stayed in Denmark, not because he was snubbed, but because the position they had put him in 9 years earlier had no dignified exit. The myth did not come from nowhere. There was a genuine snub that year. At the workers' concert, the acoustic test held before the official opening, Davis Hughes thanked the 3 Australian architects who had completed the building and made no mention of Jørn Utzon at all. And there is a man who really was written out of that day. His name was Eugene Goossens, the English conductor who arrived in 1947, found the town hall inadequate and began saying publicly that Sydney must have an opera house. He convinced Cahill. He championed Bennelong Point. Without him, there is no competition and no Utzon. In 1956, he was destroyed by a personal scandal, resigned, left the country and died 6 years later. At the opening of the building, he had spent years demanding nobody mentioned him. 2 absent men. 1 invited and declined. 1 dead and unnamed. Over 50 years, the stories seem to have run together, and the wrong man ended up carrying the grievance. And here is where this story stops being about a building. Utzon's departure destroyed his friendship with Ovi Arup, the engineer without whom the shells could not have stood up. Arup faced an agonizing choice in 1966 over whether to resign alongside him, and did not, and the two were permanently estranged. Years later, a mutual friend brought Arup all the way to Hellebeck and left him waiting in a hotel while he went ahead to try to reunite them. Utzon refused to see him. They met once more in London in 1978 at a reception after Utzon won the Royal Gold Medal. They shook hands and exchanged a few words. By the accounts of those present, it was brief and full of loss on both sides. And Davis Hughes did very well. He remained Minister for Public Works until January of 1973, the year the building was completed. On leaving Parliament, he was appointed Agent General for New South Wales in London. 2 years later, he was knighted. He died in 2003, aged 92. The man who in 1966 refused a fee that left an architect unable to pay his own staff, left public life with a knighthood and a posting to London. Peter Hall's fate was quieter, and in some ways worse. He finished the most famous building in the Southern Hemisphere, and his profession never let him have it. He had spent 7 years reconstructing a design that did not exist, and the verdict of the architectural world was largely that he should not have tried. He kept working on the building anyway. In the 1980s, he came back to repave the forecourt and create the lower concourse, deliberately in line with Utzon's original ideals. Nobody made him do that. He was still, 20 years on, serving another man's vision. And then, in 1995, the drawings came out. An exhibition opened at the Sydney Opera House called Unseen Utzon. It displayed Utzon's final design drawings, the ones Hall had never been given, the material that had sat in storage while he spent 7 years reconstructing what he could not see. It ran until the end of June. It reopened every old wound in Australian architecture. The pro-Utzon camp held the drawings up as proof he had possessed solutions to every problem. Others pointed out that not one of them was an actual working drawing. Peter Hall died on the 19th of May, 1995, in the middle of that exhibition. He was 64. The cause was a stroke, and by the accounts of his family and of the National Gallery that holds his portrait, he died destitute. Those who knew him believe the exhibition contributed to his decline. It was not until 2006, 11 years after his death, that the Royal Australian Institute of Architects gave him its 25-year award. In reviewing his work, they found the venues to be among the major achievements of Australian architects of the 1960s and 70s, and said that combined with Utzon's great vision, they formed one of the world's great working buildings. That is the profession that ostracized him, saying so in public, a decade after he was dead. Utzon lived a long time. He built a church in Denmark that is considered a masterpiece, houses in Mallorca, a parliament building in Kuwait, and slowly, over decades, the world came around to what had happened to him in Sydney. When he received the Royal Gold Medal in 1978, he said that if there had been a tiny scar on his soul from the Sydney tragedy, it was hereby completely removed, which is the sort of thing a very gracious man says in public. In 1985, he was appointed to the Order of Australia. In 1999, the Premier of New South Wales invited him to write a set of design principles to guide the building's future, and he did it from Denmark, with his son acting for him in Sydney. In 2004, a reception hall was remade to his design and named the Utzon Room. It is the only interior in the building that is his. He designed it without ever seeing the room. In 2003, he won the Pritzker Prize. In 2007, the Opera House became a World Heritage Site, and he became only the second person in history to see a work of his own listed in his own lifetime. Jørn Utzon died in his sleep in Denmark in November of 2008, aged 90. The sails of the Opera House were darkened in mourning. He never went back. In his later years, when invitations came, he cited his health, and by the end, he was nearly blind from a degenerative eye condition, so even had he flown to Sydney, he might not have seen it clearly. He said in an interview a decade before his death that it was all part of an education, and that he could not be bitter about anything in life. So did Australia make sure he never saw it finished? Not in the way the myth says. Nobody barred him from the opening. The invitation was real, and the flights were offered. But look at what was actually done to him. A government stopped paying a man for work he had completed until he could not pay his own staff. It set him a condition he could not meet, and then used his failure to meet it as grounds to withhold his fee. It accepted a resignation it had provoked within hours, and had replacements lined up by the evening. It never asked him back. And then, 7 years later, it invited him to a party. By that point, there was no version of attending that was not humiliating. He could come and lie about the building, or come and insult his hosts. Those were the two options the New South Wales government had left him, and he took the third one, which was to stay home and write a courteous letter. That is what made sure, not the invitation. The 9 years before it. The 5,000 drawings his assistant put into storage came out in 1972 and went to the State Library of New South Wales, where they remain. He left the whole design of it behind in the city he walked away from. And the building stands on Bennelong Point, on the ground the Gadigal called Tubagul, a gathering place where people came to eat and sing and tell each other stories, which is now a gathering place where millions come every year to do the same thing.